Welcome to Season 1, Episode 2 of Digital Dissection, where we take a closer and possibly unnecessary look into some of our favorite properties. Today's episode dives deep into the first entry in the Back to the Future trilogy, examining the rules this first movie holds to itself and the implications that are often ignored by viewers.
Now, before we get into the episode, we'd like to address a few housekeeping items. Now, Digital Dissection is hosted by Joe and Mark. Those are the two guys talking to you today. We are a homegrown operation that thrives on your likes, comments, and your subscribing. So you can join the conversation on YouTube at the Digital Dissection Podcast, as well as on Facebook and Twitter by searching at Digital Dissect 1 or Digital Dissection, a nerd podcast. Now, Joe, it may seem like we're being overly nostalgic out the gate with two juggernauts from the 80s, but that's not really by design, is it?
No. I mean, the 80s are the closest we've been since the 1920s in a long time, when it was an era of conspicuous spending for those who are the biggest conspicuous spenders. So people lived big in the 80s because we could. And because of that, it's left a pretty big mark on our American culture.
Yeah, the movies and the music definitely made it, past the test of time. Unfortunately, hot pink t-shirts and short shorts just didn't quite, unfortunately.
No, leg warmers and curb feelers have both died out, although one of the two attempted to make a small comeback there for just a hot second.
Well, one thing that has changed noticeably, I would say, is that time travel has changed quite a bit since 1985, hasn't it?
Yeah, it really has. When you look at how time travel is usually done in movies, it's done in typically about 4 or 5 ways. And one that actually predates Back to the Future is actually the realistic method of time travel, where time travel is basically a one-way trip, in that you're not allowed to go back to the past because it plays off of Einstein's theory of relativity and time dilation, where the closer you get to the speed of light, you observe space differently than everyone else who's moving slower than you are. Therefore, as you approach that speed, what feels like seconds or even like days to you is going to be years for everyone else who's experiencing it at a slower speed. So you just kind of keep propelling yourself further and further into the future compared to everyone else. So that's what Planet of the Apes did in the 70s with Heston, which is why he thinks he's somewhere else, but he's really just on Earth with all those damn dirty apes. That also gets done again in Ender's Game. They do the same thing. Other than that, you kind of get like these like they're like self-consistent or basically do-over mentalities, where you get to come from the future, go back to a past event, and redo it. And you keep the knowledge each time you make it further into the future of when you go back to the past every single time. But everything else kind of remains static. So even if you see your past self, they just kind of keep playing out the same thing over and over again. And that's like what happens in Groundhog Day with Bill Murray. He just keeps doing the same thing over and over and over again. And even though that one's a little different, where he doesn't run into, I don't think he runs into past versions of himself, everything else behaves exactly like it did, because that's just what time is supposed to do. Other than that, you also have kind of like the Doctor Who mentality, of which case you can just kind of go back whenever you feel like and do whatever you feel like, and it's going to just basically change the outcome of the future. It doesn't create anything new. It's just now the future does this instead. But time is also this weird like conscious construct, in which case there are fixed points in history that no matter what you try and do, they will always happen. So like one of my favorite Doctor Who episodes that was out there, the Vincent Van Gogh episode with the 11th Doctor, where no matter what they did, they actually brought Vincent Van Gogh into the future. And if you haven't seen this yet, it's been, I don't know, forever and a day. I'm not spoiling it. Too bad. I'm sorry, but I guess spoiler warnings. They bring Vincent Van Gogh into the future. He sees he was a success, even though he wasn't one in his own lifetime. he still ends up going crazy, chopping off his ear, eventually takes his own life, sort of thing. So there's just fixed points in history. No matter what you do, it doesn't get to change it. Um, and then there's one, actually, before we explain like the last way, we might as well just explain kind of how it works in Back to the Future, where you go into the back and you go back in the past. The very act of you going back into the past now changes the flow of time or changes the future. And so
Yeah.
everything you do will basically create a new timeline. Um,
Yeah,
so
which is, I think from
mhm,
the creators of Back to the Future, Robert Zemeckis and
mhm,
Bob Gale, I think for them it was much easier just to, pick a central point in time
mhm,
and then have that influence, the rest of what occurs, right?
yep,
So that's not necessarily time fluidity, which is what you
mhm,
mentioned a little bit more of with Doctor Who, where
mhm,
events are concurrent. They
yeah,
they happen, and regardless of where you observe that event, they've either happened or they haven't, right?
that's correct.
So it's it's interesting uh, to see how much changes have occurred
Mhm,
with the idea of time travel since
yeah.
then. And it's hard to believe that 1985 is that long ago.
Yeah, I mean, I still think of like 30 years ago, oh, that was the 1970s. That's no big deal. But oh, wait, no. 30 years ago was, 1990 one at this point. So that's weird.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's not, I'm not used to it. I don't
I
think I ever will be.
absolutely, yeah, I absolutely am not used to it yet. But you know what? The good news here is that there's a lot of good nostalgia attached to Back to the Future.
Yes.
And
Mm-hmm.
and rather than dive into, how we came into the property like we did with Ghostbusters,
Mm-hmm.
I think what would be really interesting is to analyze exactly how Doc Brown, Dr. Emmett Brown, the main one of the main characters of this movie, he really manipulates time in a way that's advantageous only to himself. And analyzing some of that is pretty unique because on its head, Back to the Future looks like just like a plucky comedy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It seems that way. I mean, you have a high school kid who has the girl of his dreams meets plucky disgraced nuclear physicist, and we have a movie.
Which is something that for those listening at home.
Mm-hmm.
So Joe and I have talked about this topic many times, but one of the ones that I find interesting, well, we will throw one of those top
Mm-hmm.
10 trivia things out at you here, is exactly how Marty McFly and Dr. Emmett Brown met. And Joe, I'm not sure if you remember this story, but I'm prepared to tell it if you haven't.
You go right there. And for those for the John Mulaney fans out there, um, the bit is still fantastic because to figure this out, um, you could watch all three movies and it's never said. In three movies, they never say how Marty and Doc meet. You basically have to find that out all on your own, which when you were once basically just withheld to VHS, I don't see how it was possible.
No, no, and
No.
actually, it wasn't possible until years after the movie came out
Mm-hmm.
because, once again, this is one of those things where you've watched Ghostbusters and you view it a different way as a child and as an adult. With Back to the Future, it's kind of the same way. You watch this movie and you're just interested in the action that happens, but really, why would a teenager be hanging out with an elderly person that he's not related to and be performing these experiments, right?
Yeah,
So
I'm lost on it. I didn't hang out with elderly people when I was 14 years old. Wait, no,
I'm
wait, no,
pretty,
he's 17. I
yeah.
take it back. He's 17. In which case, I still did not hang out with the elderly when I was 17 years old. I do now in some cases. But that's mostly because of my line of work, and I can't help that.
Well, and we don't need to go into those court cases either, but
No, no.
but it's actually a story that co-creator Bob Gale mentioned about the origins of the Back to the Future story, and Emmett Brown basically gets this reputation in the town that he's in, which is pretty prevalent in the film itself. But
Hmm.
Marty McFly hears about Emmett Brown and he hears about this secret lab that he has, and so he's just naturally interested in it. So what does he do? He does what any teenager would do,
He
and
breaks
he
into the lab.
Yeah, he commits a little light, B&E, right?
Well, who
But
doesn't? Who doesn't? We've all been there.
well, and that is one of the few things about Dr. Emmett Brown today that we will mention is not going to make him a time monster.
Mm-mm.
Instead of calling the police and having Marty spend a night in the tank, he just introduces him to what he's doing.
Yeah, Doc Brown is actually very happy that someone doesn't think he's a lunatic or that he's basically I guess a bad person. And I don't want to say bad person, but he doesn't think Doc is crazy, and this is new and refreshing to Doc Brown. So after learning this, he instead just decides to show Marty around.
Yeah, and
Hmm.
that kind of brings us fast forward, if you will, to ripping off Libyans for for radioactive material,
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
and sending people back to the past, as it will. But you know,
Hmm.
since you and I have talked about this topic many times, I think it's actually more interesting that people don't actually talk about this in the way that we have.
No, no, they don't, because a lot of times when people bring up what we're going to bring up, they refer to Back to the Future parts 2 and 3.
Mhm.
So and those are like very, very like glaring like mistakes, not mistakes, but they're very glaring issues where because of certain events, other things either shouldn't be possible or or someone should be dead.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Which is the absolutely tragic case of what we'll be discussing today. And no, this isn't true crime. This is just
Mm-mm.
analyzing deeply part one of Back to the Future. So the reason why we want to talk about part one and kind of isolate it to that conversation is exactly what Joe just mentioned. Back to the Future one really behaves within its own rules. And those rules actually change somewhat as we go through part two and part
Hmm.
three. And so, yeah, you get these rule changes kind of on the fly. It's almost like playing a game that your friend made up on the schoolyard, and then right when you start winning, they're like, "No, we're going to reframe this so that you can't." Right?
Yep.
It,
Hmm.
it just changes a little bit each time. So, yeah. So the big thing here, what we want to point out, and this is probably going to make the thumbnail for the episode, is that there is no scenario in Back to the Future one where there is not a Marty McFly who is either erased by time or dies in a very I'm assuming very painful way.
You would think, yeah, like I can't see um being written out of history as a painless process.
I would assume it would be at minimum a little uncomfortable, right?
Very. I mean, there's even at one point in the movie where we start to see it happen to who we'll refer to as like basically Marty A. As we go on here,
Hmm.
when he sees his hand being unwritten, like he does not look comfortable in that scene at all. And this has to have happened, the unwriting process, to at least one Marty McFly in this
Yeah.
movie. So yeah,
And
we didn't even talk about the fact that um, this happened to two other people before it started happening to Marty.
yeah, I mean, because even Doc Brown references that this isn't a very good picture because they cut your brother's head off.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine you're like the McFly family having breakfast like they do, like Marty walks out and everybody's there, and you're his older brother just chowing down, and all of a sudden half of your head's gone.
Oh, oh. Okay, and then let's think about that too, because it's not like Marty, where his hand slowly disappears and it's oh no, my hand is gone. I'm sweaty, my knees are weak, my arms are heavy, except for the one that's disappearing.
Yeah.
This guy's head is just gone. So without the head, his body can't just actively do stuff. So like your body's gonna flop over the table. Alcoholic mom and completely nervous wreck weird dad are watching this happen.
Well, and the sister too, though. I
And the
mean,
sister too, yeah.
because she disappears totally different from the same
Mm-hmm.
way that Marty does. So for some reason, it's like who decided Zemeckis and Gail back in the trailer writing this thing, who like yeah, hey, you know what? Let's have the sister and the brother literally get decapitated by
Mm-hmm.
time, and then Marty gets this distinctive
This
classy
side
death
wiping,
here.
yeah. This slow exit stage left because it's
God,
his left hand that's going away. But yeah, brother and sister, they're just off with their head immediately.
and this isn't to detract from what we're going to talk about in just a few
Mm-mm.
moments, but Honestly, when we talked about horrific implications of this movie, I didn't even think about this part being
No,
up
and
there with some of
also
the worst.
this part is no one's fault, I guess, except Marty's, because he done screwed up and didn't let his dad get hit by a car.
It is true.
Yeah, so I guess like for those of you listening, hopefully you've heard your parents tell the story of how they've met. I have heard mine. I know where they met, and I know how things happened. And in the event that I go back in time, it's actually pretty safe because no one gets hit by a car. But yeah, if you know how your parents met and you go back in time, you just let them be.
Yeah,
Otherwise, someone's losing a head slowly but surely.
mom, dad, if you're listening to this, I promise that I will never wind up in Hawaii in the late 1970s. I will just, I'll just probably hang out in
Yeah.
California for a bit.
Mm-hmm. Or heck, even if you do end up in Hawaii in the late 1970s, there's just so much more things you could do other than hang around your parents. It's Hawaii.
Yeah.
Enjoy
Well,
yourself.
I just not to get too far away from what we're trying to focus on, but I just realized that if I did hang out in California in the
Mm-hmm.
70s, I mean, that was literally during the time of the Night Stalker,
Oh, get out of there,
and
dude.
uh, speaking of losing your head,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, great segue, but either way, yeah, it's
Nice.
just absolutely horrifying to think that you could just be enjoying your dinner and all of a sudden your son, your daughter's heads are gone, and you have literally no explanation of what's going
Mhm.
like
They're
what's
just
happening.
they're just they're just there shouting. That has to be it. They're just
Oh my
screaming
god.
at the breakfast table because their children's heads are just they're gone. They're broke. They have no money. Their pets' heads are falling off. Like what's next?
I,
What's next?
I shouldn't be laughing at this, but I am. But yeah. Well, either way, moving on.
Moving on, moving on.
Let's get back to what we're focusing on today. Who haven't watched Back to the Future, we're not going to make fun of you. Well, at least not to your face, but
Nope.
it's been out
I
for a
go
while.
back.
So,
Yep.
there's no spoiler alert here
Mm-hmm.
because it shouldn't be necessary. But the photo that Marty McFly has with him in the past, it shows his brother and his sister and him. If we're looking at things based on, things being erased by history, wouldn't it be safe to assume that Marty wouldn't be the last thing to be erased from the photo?
Yeah, that's clearly like that has to be like that I think that's like as a method as a Zemeckis method of just showing that the character is running out of time to complete what he's doing. Because really, they should all just be unwritten at the same time. It shouldn't be, oh, well, mom and dad don't get together, therefore kid number one slowly disappears first, then two, then me. That you would that shouldn't be how it works. It should just be nope, you're all gone.
Either that they're all
Yeah.
gone,
Mm-hmm.
or I would assume that the further that time, timeline A, right, the one that the
Mm-hmm.
original Marty comes from,
Yep.
the more that we deviate from that, I would think the last actions of things from that universe would be unwritten first, right? It's order of operations, but the other way around, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I looked at that, I always went, Marty probably should have been the first thing to erase in that photo. But
Mm-hmm.
then again, we wouldn't have much of a movie at that point.
Yeah, that's
So
true. Yep. We have to
that's
have
why
a
we are
slight bit of plot armor for Marty here.
here.
If
Of
we
which,
completely strip him of that, we have no movie.
yeah, and I think we've danced around it long enough, but we can definitely get to the point
Mm-hmm.
of one, why we think Doc Brown is a monster of time travel. But I let's just nip it right in the bud.
Let's do it. Yeah.
There's a reason why Marty does not survive, or at least one version of Marty.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to go into some crazy storytelling here for just a moment, just to frame this out a little bit.
Okay.
Because in the first movie, we're introduced to two timelines, right? We've got timeline A, so we've got original Marty.
Mm-hmm.
We're introduced to original Doc Brown, who is deceased, by the way, because the properties of this universe don't involve fluidic time travel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, Doc Brown is functionally, bodied. He is dead,
Mm-hmm.
right? He's been shot up. So timeline A, Doc Brown is dead. The mall is obviously called Twin Pines Mall.
Yep. At that time. Mm-hmm.
The land of Old Man Peabody, who was he was obsessed with breeding pine trees.
He was gonna get there.
Well,
Sounds like
he I think he knew what he was doing.
Oh, he knew what he was doing. However, no one was buying what
Yeah.
he was selling, and that's why we got a mall
But
and
at minimum, though,
not a nursery of pines, a
those
pinery.
two trees were having fun, though.
Oh yeah, Twin Pines, man. We remember them forever. That's why the mall is named after them.
Yeah, stuff you can't show, on TV. It'd be an edited version, but either way, we're getting away from it a little bit. But
Mm-hmm.
his parents are down their luck. All right, timeline A is just not good to the McFly family. Biff
Mm-mm.
reigns supreme over them.
Yep.
He's driving drunk in their car, which apparently he wasn't aware blind spots existed.
No, and I don't know how you'd be aware of a blind spot when you smash the front end of your vehicle too. Also a weird thing. Biff might be lying about something here. We may have to discredit his character a little bit. He doesn't seem like he's as nice as he's trying to lay on.
Yeah, and to his discredit, though, he is drunk, so maybe that's part of it. But
He is a little drunk. Yes.
either way, and to round out the unfortunate scenario for the McFlys, his his brother and sister are frankly, kind of on the underpants of society.
Yeah.
They're just kind of living at home, and this is no offense against folks that work in the fast food industry, but
No, no, no.
the picture they were framing is that it's not high society. It's not high society living at all. And so timeline A is obviously not the most ideal for these characters, but either way, at the experiment where the DeLorean's unveiled and we kick on off to 1955, there's a few details that are important to pay attention to. And one of the big ones is that the Libyans are chasing Marty, and Marty is driving his DeLorean directly towards this photo booth, right?
Yes.
And he disappears just before hitting that photo booth. So the Libyans obviously crash through that. So in timeline B, right? So Marty goes back to 1955 and has himself a grand old time altering things from his family's past. Well, we get to timeline B, where original Marty exists, and we have Doc B, right? Doc Brown, side B.
Yeah, he has to be. Yep, he's
survived
different.
Yeah, he's a totally different guy. He survived the events of the changed 1955. So he's introduced to the flux capacitor and the time machine after he literally just hit his head on the sink.
Yep. So he drew that out, and then he
get-
actually gets to see it right away.
Yeah, exactly. He gets to see the immediate fruits of his labor, right? And in this case, it was a concussion, most likely.
Yep.
But timeline B features a Doc Brown who lived his entire life knowing that he was successful, knowing that he created this magical tool that can take you throughout time. So already we've got different characters that have a different frame than the original ones did, right? The ones that we first get introduced to in the movie. One of the slight Easter eggs, though, that I mentioned with Twin Pines Ball is that when Marty goes back, obviously he runs over one of those pines.
He did. He took one of those out. Yeah.
We got Lone Pine Mall,
which is a great little Easter egg, or like attention to detail that they did put in that movie. Very fun.
And it's easy to miss too, by the way, because I mean, I think even as a kid, I missed that detail for a good decade before the graininess of VHS went away and higher clarity was provided. But it's definitely an easy one to miss. But but ultimately, though, we've got two timelines now. So we have the timeline A, we've got timeline B. So how is Marty McFly dead? Is what the real question is.
That's where I think we're all wondering. Like, Mark, we need to get this story going. How is he dead? Because everything seems like it's fine. All that's changed is we've lost a pine tree. But no,
we've lost a pine tree and someone punched a rapist, right? Like that's really the big difference so far.
Yep.
Well, going back to the photo booth and going back to Marty driving through it, when he comes back to the timeline B of 1985, he basically witnesses the exact same events unfold that happened to him when he left.
Yeah.
The Libyans roll up, they shoot up Doc Brown.
Yep.
And you see Marty take off in the DeLorean, and that Marty existed in that timeline for his entire life.
Yeah. Marty B was always there in this newly adjusted timeline.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's Marty B, who, which sounds like a Cardi B, but Marty B has lived out his entire life in this changed universe where the McFlys are they're successful people. You've got subservient Biff, who, he was punched in the face by George McFly, and
Mm-hmm.
now he's doing all their auto detailing, right?
Yeah, which by the
So,
way, I'd like to point out when you see that 85 Toyota black pickup truck, Biff did a heck of a job on that.
oh, he
I'm gonna
did
throw that out there. As someone who's had a buff before, and I
mhm.
used to have like the advantage of using like a buffing machine. Um, yeah, black, stupid hard to buff. Good job on that one, Biff. That's the one thing I give you. Great job on that one.
And at minimum, we've got 2 coats on that thing. I don't think he was
Minimum.
lying on
No,
that
he
one.
definitely didn't skip, which is probably why he wanted to skip on the second coat in the BMW because the time into that truck. Get out of here.
I mean, you spent all that time making that truck look like a snack, and you just don't want to go back and have to do it all over again.
No,
The
no, no,
days
no.
the days running out of daylight, right?
Mm-hmm.
But either way, getting back to this photo booth, I know I've mentioned it a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
So Marty B drives through directly the same trajectory, right to that same photo booth, and all of a sudden, poof, he's gone, just like Marty A was.
Just like you're supposed to, yeah.
So if we're talking about, let's just, and I'm not a physicist by any means, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of have watched several bits of sci-fi here, and I think one good example would be the show Fringe, right? If you remember
Mm-hmm.
the Fox show that lasted for about 5 seasons, had pretty awesome cast on it. But the long story short, what Fringe talked about was these universes coming together and overriding each other because 2 objects can't occupy the same space, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about it through that framing, because of what we have as evidence here, there's not really a possible way for both Martys to exist if they're occupying the same plane. And at this point in time, they literally do occupy the exact same moment in 1955.
Yep. Yeah, when
Because
Marty A
yeah,
went through the barn, Marty B is going through the exact same barn in the exact same trajectory.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. He's going towards the same barn on old Peabody's, plot of land there.
Mm-hmm.
And so it there basically what happens, right? Like there's people who would say, like, I can already think of folks that would say, well, it's possible that they just shared memories and all of a sudden, we've got the same Marty occupying the same vessel,
Yeah, but
right?
that's how time travel works in Harry Potter, but that is not how time travel was laid out to work in this movie. That's the
Yeah.
problem. That's where the issue lies.
Well, and there's one way to immediately trump that point of
Mm-hmm.
view, which is why I wanted to bring it up because I could immediately disprove it, was that Marty, when he comes back to timeline B,
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't know about any of these events. He doesn't know that his sister is now the talk of the town and has guys calling her all the time, which
Nope.
seriously, guys, she can only date one person at one time.
Come
You know,
on. Mm-hmm.
his brother is no longer working fast food. He always wears a
No,
suit to the office, right?
always. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And Marty has absolutely no knowledge of any of these things. He doesn't
Mm-mm.
know that his father's written a book. He has no idea that the car's not totaled anymore.
Yep.
So immediately we can disprove that there's a chance that they've mind melded, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if they did, okay, well then Marty would just be living his life, his best life
Yeah,
possible.
there would be no shock at the end of the movie.
Yeah, exactly. So the reason why Dr. Emmett Brown is a monster is because there's only 2 people who really know about what happened to impact the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of those 2 people, there's one who benefits the most here. And it's the guy who would have got shot up by Libyans, okay? It's Doc Brown
Yep.
himself.
Yep.
He keeps the letter that Marty McFly gives him and claims that he tore it up, and he uses it to save his own ass.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that on its head isn't really all that inherently evil, right? Like we all would do something like that. If we could directly impact events that, maybe seemingly altered things in the smallest ways, sure, whatever.
Yeah,
But
a big way. That's a big way. Avoiding your own death. Come on.
true,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It basically violates his own prime directive here, but that's not the detail I want to focus on. The detail is that Dr. Emmett Brown knows that Marty B will exist in this universe, like having no knowledge whatsoever
Mm-hmm.
that what's about to happen that night involves him being overwritten by time.
Yep.
That's what makes Emmett Brown inherently evil, because it's funny you would mention Harry Potter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's almost reminiscent of what Snape and Dumbledore do when they realize that Harry has to die in order for the events to truly unfold. Like a
Mm-hmm.
pig
And
meant
one
for
of them is
slaughter.
okay with that, just like Doc Brown is definitely okay with Marty B. McFly dying.
Yeah, yeah. And the only difference, though, is that Doc Brown says, "I figured, what the hell."
Yep. He
Yeah,
just throws that out there like, yeah, forget about it. Why
it's
not?
it's okay. We'll we'll
You only
we'll
live
just
once, right? That's what the kids are saying. No, they're not saying that anymore. That was a long time ago. But that's his methodology, more or less. Is he figures basically why not?
yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. I figure, what the hell. And so, as I watched that movie as a kid, I always took a step back for a moment, because how on earth could you look at it as a comedy anymore when you realize that
When you know that Doc Brown's a bit of a monster.
he really is. I
Yeah.
mean,
Hmm.
think about it, man. Like he did something horrible to his poor dog, right? You remember Einstein,
Yep.
he's
Hmm.
adorable, he's long-haired, he's shaggy. And this dog is spending like just massive amounts of time by himself with food he doesn't even want to eat. I mean,
No.
you saw that in the beginning of the film, right? Like,
Yep. I mean, there was a ton. I mean, that's not like Doc Brown and like yeah, like you were alluding to the beginning of the film. We've got the robot arm feeding the dog food, and that dog food has been piling up for days with Einstein not eating it.
yeah,
And I think that's supposed to imply they've been gone for a while, but considering that, Doc had the plutonium crate also right next to that, I don't think they've been gone for that long.
yeah, they couldn't have. And
No.
you bring up a really good point. I mean, the news is literally playing that a facility had plutonium stolen from it just the
Hmm.
night before.
That just night before. It's one day. So Doc Brown is knowingly feeding his dog crap the dog doesn't want to eat.
Consistently.
Monster.
I mean that, and that's almost like part one
Hmm.
of the issues of Doc Brown, right? Because
Yep.
there's more to come. So part one of the issue of Doc Brown being a time monster, it really grows tentacles, because the actions of Marty McFly going back to 1955, by extension of Doc Brown's decisions, also turn into other things. And what they actually end up doing is really, taking civil rights away, or at least the inspirations for some of these civil rights movements
Hmm.
to happen. And when you think about it, like Goldie Wilson, Mayor Goldie Wilson, so the black mayor of the town, he's working in the diner when he first goes back,
Yep.
and he's already mayor in 1985.
He is. Marty knows he's mayor. We see that right away off the bat in the movie when I think when he's roller skating, not roller skating, skateboarding around. I'm sorry, that was a lot cooler than roller skating in the 80s. He's skating around and you see um, the posters to reelect Mayor Goldie Wilson.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. So Mayor Goldie Wilson is already, he's already successful. He's already won the position. But by this experiment happening, Marty McFly goes back and essentially takes that free will away from Goldie Wilson. And I'm not saying that it's truly as bad as part one of this, right? Like with what Doc Brown does to Marty B. But when you think about that as one isolated incident, okay, whatever. That's just kind of on its own, right? But then Marty does the exact same thing to Marvin Berry when he sings Johnny Be Good.
Hmm.
His cousin calls him up and says, "Hey Marvin, that
Yep.
sound you've been looking for? Well,
Beautiful.
listen to this."
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
They were. Hmm.
So like we've
Oh,
got,
that's it.
it's like what did Zemeckis and Gale have against these guys, right? Like were
Yeah,
they out to
being their own made men are now it's like, oh, well, they're actually that way because Marty McFly made them that way. Hmm.
which by extension happens because of Doc Brown, right?
Hmm.
And so even though that is like, circumstantial, right? It's
Yeah.
take it or leave it. But after looking at this film many times and seeing it this way,
Hmm.
it's hard to not notice now, right?
Yeah, it really is. It's like, is this I mean, is it circumstantial or you could almost, it's almost, I almost wonder if like you could view it as like a betrayal of how this movie actually establishes how time works. Because like you said, there should be like a resounding impact of Marty doing this, but it's almost like these things were going to happen anyway. And it's almost like the Harry. This is where it's almost like the Harry Potter time travel, where these things were going to happen anyway. So even though Marty went back in time and caused them, basically just meant Marty always was going to go back in time and cause them. And I don't know if that's really implied that that's how that happens in this movie, or it's just meant to be um kind of like a fun little jab or stab by Zemeckis, like, oh, that's the reason why these things happen is because someone back in time and did them. But yeah, no, very yeah, I think maybe he just has something against the civil rights movement. No, I don't want to say that. That might
Well,
be a bit
and
much.
and that was my
Mm-hmm.
next part, was that I'm not trying to say that Zemeckis and Gale,
Mm-hmm.
necessarily had a problem with civil rights, but it's a really bad look,
It is a
right?
bad look. Yeah, it's a tough sell. It's no good.
Yeah, it's a tough sell
Mm-hmm.
because we just mentioned that time fluidity is not how Back to the Future views time travel.
No,
You know,
not
they
at all.
they rely on specific actions impacting others at
Mm-hmm.
points in time.
Yep. And then
So
when those actions are changed, you create basically a new timeline, a new reality.
yeah, essentially. And so that's why it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me that Marty
Mm-hmm.
McFly would need to be the catalyst for these decisions or for these things to happen. Because if they were already going to happen anyway, just as you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
why even have them do it? You
Yeah.
know?
Why do it? Other than the writers just thought it would be funny.
Yeah.
Or something more sinister. Again, I'm not going to say that. The thought popped in my head. But it could be a bit, I don't know, could be something, or it could be just a really bad joke.
Well, and that's kind of what I sum it up to after
Mm-hmm.
after multiple continuous viewings of this movie is that, yeah, they're when you obviously view it through the lens of a normal thinking person, I would say a
Mm-hmm.
well-adjusted person, and I'm not referring to myself anymore. Um, you know, these jokes, these little sticks, like
Mm-hmm.
they just seem plucky because that's how Marty McFly does things. He flies by the seat of his pants, no pun
Yep.
intended.
Mm-hmm.
But looking at it this way, they didn't have to happen, and now they have. So either way, we've got some really, weird things that are starting to test even the fabric of this movie, uh, even within part one. We can analyze part two and three, I think, together because those movies are actually shot together.
Yep.
So
Mm-hmm.
that seems like, okay, maybe that one's a little more self-contained.
Yeah.
But within this, it just doesn't make any sense. And I mean, I still can't figure out why you would even do it at this point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm in the same boat. Like, I don't see the point in making these subtle little jabs at the future like that. Other than I just don't know. I'm lost on it. Why bother doing them at all? Some things like they do make sense, like small cute things, like you said, like going from the Twin Pines Mall to the Lone Pine Mall. But why make Marty be responsible for these two one legitimate African American for his success, and then the other for just the character's success. Um, I am lost on that. But one thing that apparently where he does draw the line is doing the nasty and the pasty, um, as Fry so elegantly put it in Futurama. Um, he does basically sees like, oh, my mom is young and awkwardly attractive. Um, and decides not to act on that, which case, good for Marty. Way to not bang your mom.
And I will equal parts agree and disagree with you, only because we didn't have Futurama yet, right?
We didn't have it yet,
And
no. Mm-mm.
and it seems like to me there's better ways to solve problems than with incest. I'm just going to put that out there. Um, which also, really starts to
Mm-hmm.
examine other areas of this movie that are equally, problematic now.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why that was even the case from the beginning. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I obviously understand you got to build a plot, right? And
Yep.
and the plot advances because Marty pushes his dad out of the way,
Mm-hmm.
and gets hit by his grandpa. But the as we begin to peel back layers of this movie, there's so many things that if you were maybe overly sensitive, or if you were reading between the lines, some of
Mm-hmm.
these themes are just really strange. So we've already got the, we'll just call it unwriting civil rights. You
Yep.
know, we've already got this paradox of multiple Martys,
Mm-hmm.
which I will return to in just a moment.
Yeah, we'll get
But
back there. And they
but
mean,
the
and at the same time, since we're on the subject of getting back to things, when we eventually do make T-shirts, um, we will have there are better ways to solve problems than incest be one of the T-shirts.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
I guess it depends on who we take it to because you know there are there are printers out there that will say, yeah, I'm not going to touch that one.
Yeah, that's not with the 10-meter cattle prod guy, so I'm sorry.
No,
Um,
no, not at all.
but if it's me just making them, with iron-ons in my basement, I'll make that shirt. I won't wear it, but if you're willing to pay me money for it, I'll make that shirt for you.
Well, you know, the one of the items I wanted to bring up here is
Mm-hmm.
we mentioned we're going to get back to it, and I know I'm going to actually pull a Robert Zemeckis myself and break
Okay.
my own rules because I know I've been saying
Ooh.
I want to keep this within Back to the Future one.
Mm-hmm.
Now, after hearing about Doc Brown, Time Monster, and we've got Marty who's being overwritten by time,
Yes.
there is one thing that we can look at within this universe that might actually disprove me slightly.
Okay.
Now, the only reason why I say slightly is because
Mm-hmm.
there are a few people out there who have played the Telltale Games Back to the Future, game. Okay.
Okay.
Now, if you haven't played a Telltale game before, what it draws their inspirations from is the action adventure genre of games from the basically the late 80s into the early 90s. If you remember, Joe, there was the segment on the documentary that we watched
Mm-hmm.
that addresses this action adventure point and click genre where you acquire items and you put them together and you try to puzzle solve and you have dialogue options, all kinds of stuff, right?
Okay.
So Telltale Games basically forms out of a bunch of studios that became defunct over time, and people kind of move like schools of fish from one company to the next. So,
Yeah, people got to
once,
eat, right? Got to make food. Got to make money somehow.
yeah, I was going to
Mm-hmm.
say, not everybody's Freb. Um, for those watching at home, once again, that's a very blunt Gone in 60 Seconds reference. Just wanted to make sure y'all know that.
And appreciate it because we'll get there.
We'll get there too. So anyway, Telltale Games. We've got
Mm-hmm.
the Back to the Future game, and it's a pretty well made game that pays a lot of homage to the series. It's a really fun one. I enjoyed it, even though it's fairly amateur from even a Telltale Games standpoint. They got really good at Game of the Year edition games with The Walking Dead and Game of Thrones, and they really upped their game later on. But the Back to the Future game actually dives into the early life of Emmett Brown, so long before we're ever introduced to him in the movies.
Mm-hmm.
And spoiler alert for those who haven't played the Telltale game Back to the Future, at the end of the game, once we've hit the climax and we've beaten it and everything, Marty is actually greeted by what I believe is 5 alternate timeline Marty McFlys, each one
Oh.
with different clothing, each one saying, well, there's a problem we have to solve, and this is the point where we came back to it and we know this is where we have to fix it. And, the game didn't sell that well. So we never really resolve what is actually going on there.
Oh, that's terrible.
It
Ending
is
on
what it
that
is.
one. Ooh. Ow. Yeah, now I'm mad because I don't know the end of the story and I didn't play the game, and I don't think I can now knowing that.
Well, hey,
Ouch.
sorry I ruined it for you, but the
Yep.
reason
There
why
goes the weekend. Thanks.
yeah,
God.
well, I had to bring it up because
Mm-hmm.
if I brought up this scenario acting as if it was definitive, then I would feel bad because I feel like I'd misled people knowing that information.
Mm-hmm.
But that is the only amendment I want to make to this paradox. Okay. So, what is possible within part one of Back to the Future if we ignore the point A to point B time travel impacting events by changing points in time? It is possible, based off of that game,
Mm-hmm.
that we could potentially have a Marvel Cinematic Universe version of time travel. And if you'd like to explain that, I will
Mm-hmm.
gladly let you to our 2 viewers because we doubled from our first
Mm-hmm.
episode.
Well, I'm last on like one thing that I find incredibly annoying with basically any property that does this, and some of my favorite properties have done this, is when they don't want to explain something very well, You just slap the word quantum on it and it fixes everything. Um, because it's quantum and it sounds cool. So going to the quantum realm and changing time through quantum principles. Therefore, if so facto, we shrink small enough, we end up bigger on the other side, we can change, we can grab the infinity stones. Um, it made sense to someone. I'm lost on it. It doesn't make sense to me. Um, so yeah, I can't go. I can't explain that time travel. Again, also not a physicist. I teach 10th grade biology, which I'm pretty sure is the threat of every villain in a movie who threatens to like basically destabilize the life of an accredited scientist is they're going to become me. So just because I don't get it doesn't mean it shouldn't work. But come on, guys, don't just slap quantum on things and call it okay.
Well, oddly enough, though, Joe, you did actually explain this earlier on because
Mm-hmm.
so the explanation that Smart Hulk gives us in the Avengers Endgame
Mm-hmm.
is that if you time travel, you can't travel to the past, right? Because the new future you go to becomes the past, I believe is how he wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can't go, your present becomes your past, if what the way that he wrote it. Sorry, I said that
Mm-hmm.
incorrectly. So when you time travel, your present became your past, so your past can't become your future, right?
Okay.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's the way that he explains it. I mean, honestly, I take it or leave it. I don't really care. It made for a fun movie,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
but that's really the only way that whenever I thought about this, that how could we possibly make this make sense where Marty B doesn't die, right?
Okay.
And that's potentially it because of this
Mm-hmm.
video game reference. Okay, there's potential for multiple different timelines that are getting created. So we've got branches instead of A to B.
Mm-hmm.
But the only problem with that is obviously, Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis, they didn't know this.
No,
They had
they
no idea.
they weren't doing it. They were spitballing and they knew it.
No, no, absolutely not. So
Mm-hmm.
in their lack of defense, what they did here was they murdered one Marty.
Yeah. Marty B's out.
Yep, Marty B is out, and it's because
Mm-hmm.
Doc Brown made that fateful decision,
Mm-hmm.
and it's unfortunate.
Yeah, and I would almost argue um that Doc probably knew what he was doing even before he didn't rip up the letter. I would say that and you can't say this, this is totally conjecture. When the scene in the movie uh where Marty catches Doc basically watching his recordings from the future, Doc keeps rewinding to the point just before he gets shot by the Libyans, and you can tell he rewound to that point.
Oh, you hear him
Oh
physically
yeah.
do it. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
something like 5 or 10 times.
Yeah,
You
he
know,
keeps rerunning it over and over again. So it's not a massive logical leap that has to be made that he probably saw himself get shot right there anyway.
yeah. Well, and it's true. He probably did,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why I think it's great you brought that up because Doc Brown from Timeline A,
Mm-hmm.
we barely got to know Doc Brown from Timeline A.
No, Doc A, we don't know a whole lot about.
Yeah, all we know is that he neglects his dog.
Mm-hmm.
He's got some sarcastically large audio equipment in his house.
For no reason. We don't know why that amplifier's there. What's it going to do? Clearly, it was made to fail at that size.
Oh, it's just there's no way.
Or it gets sold to a club on a pier in New York, so that eventually, when you have to take out the super shredder, you can just jam on it and it'll collapse the whole pier eventually. I know that the pier gets collapsed when the shredder knocks down the planks or not the support beams, but he got thrown into that ooze because of the massive amplifier. That's where it went. That's why it was made. You can't tell me I'm wrong because I won't hear it.
and it didn't just crush Shredder. Didn't that crush Kevin Nash? Wasn't WCW's Kevin Nash in the Shredder costume?
I'm pretty sure WCW's Kevin Nash was, in fact, in that shredder costume.
Yeah, and that's just I won't let that stand either. I won't acknowledge that.
Mm-mm, mm-mm.
But yeah, so to the point though, what's interesting here is that by creating the time machine, okay, you can't quite call it that Doc A was this evil bastard, but Doc A is what turns Doc B into what he becomes.
Mm-hmm.
Because of this, because of him creating the time machine, he actually creates this monster, right? Because Doc B views the video that Marty brings back with him, and he then chooses to do all these things because of his own creation.
Yeah. When he basically gets that validation from the future that is Doc Brown A, he's more or less, I don't want to say encouraged, but now I almost think he probably feels unstoppable. He can go ahead and do these things now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess if you have unlimited power, right, you're like
Mm-hmm.
Emperor Palpatine there.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's what those are the decisions that he ends up making. That's what he chooses to do with
Mm-hmm.
the information that's given to him. And ultimately, the reasoning for why I think it's unacceptable is because he tries to live behind the veil of protecting the space-time continuum.
Oh, yes. Which again, like that veil is very, very loose, considering that he does tell that to Marty like almost right away after like a small conversation. He tells Marty that, like, oh, you can't talk to anyone else. You haven't talked to anyone else, have you? And then Marty goes, oh no, I kept my dad from getting hit by the car that made him basically have my mom fall in love with him. And all we get is great Scott. Oh no, too bad. Except Doc was totally okay with hearing that he successfully built a time machine before that. And then, like I said before, totally pries into Marty A's like stuff and just watches the videotape from the future on his own choice. And it wasn't like accidental. Like you saw he had to like rig that like camcorder to work with his old 1950s TV. So clearly, um Doc Brown B like does not really care about the space-time continuum as much as he claims to, or at least
No.
not when it comes to him. He's an exception to the big rule. As long as he turns out okay, doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And seriously, he was like a pig looking for truffle when he dug for that camera. I mean, he absolutely dug into that. Now, this has nothing to do with the point, but I am curious as to how he found a way to rig that up to that old TV. I mean, the technology was still pretty new. I'm surprised he was even able to get it on screen.
Yeah, I don't know how it worked either. But then again, this is a disgraced nuclear physicist who I don't think at that point actually is he a disgraced nuclear physicist yet at that point? I
I
don't
don't
think he is. I think he's still doing okay in the 50s.
I don't think he's committed until the the second movie,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you know how they have the second movie where he's committed in the newspaper and they show
Oh
him in the
yeah. Well,
straitjacket.
even in the first movie, Doc, when they're at the Twin Pines Mall at the beginning of the movie, he does mention that like he basically spent his entire family fortune and resources on trying to develop the time machine, and that's part of why people thought he was crazy in the first place.
You are
So,
correct,
mhm.
actually, and it's those experiments that actually led to him burning down his mansion.
Yes, exactly, and that, oh
And
yeah, because yeah,
yeah,
he still has the mansion in
he
the
yeah
start. Yep, when he goes back to
yeah,
the past.
and it's because he doesn't have to do iterations of the experiments to make the
Hmm.
time machine work, right? So
Yep.
indirectly, the guy sets himself up
Hmm.
for a better life directly and indirectly. So maybe timeline A, Doc Brown, is just as bad as B because remember, Doc Brown A
Hmm.
also got in bed with Libyan terrorists
He did.
who helped him steal plutonium.
Was totally fine with that. And then just what he gave them basically a fake missile with pinball machine parts on the inside and was totally fine with ripping off the Libyans.
Correct.
Hmm.
Now, I
Um,
will give him some credit for this though.
yeah.
I do own an old Bally's pinball machine, and if you open that thing up and you shove that into a box and you told somebody it was a bomb
Believable.
in the 80s, I'd say
Oh
it's
yeah,
believable.
totally, completely. And we were watching the movie. Like I almost want to say that there's a chance that I don't know if Doc A dies. And this is probably mostly due to just budgeting because when you see Doc Brown get shot, and he does, when you see him die in the Twin Pines Mall versus the Lone Pine Mall, it is identical. We don't see him throw the gun because Marty just didn't get there at that point in time, but He's in the same position he was when Marty A left for the past. He falls down in the exact same manner that he did when Marty A left for the past. Everything looks basically the same. When you see Doc Brown A get shot, you don't see any blood. You don't see anything that indicates any sort of flesh wounding. You see literally just gray holes being developed into his suit, and he falls down. And when Marty gets a look at Doc Brown A dead, there's no blood accumulating anywhere. Which again, this could be because it just wasn't in the budget, or there was no time for it, and this is just a production thing. Or it could be um, Doc Brown was never going to die anyway because he knew he made the Libyans mad, and he was just kind of prepared for it. Even though he claims that they found me, I have no idea how they found me, sort of thing. Maybe he kind of just assumed this thing could happen.
That's an interesting point that I in all of my time analyzing this, I've never even thought of, which is
Doc Brown
surprising.
doesn't die, yeah. Maybe
But
the Doc never dies at all.
I was going to say, I mean, this guy just seems to have chance, luck. Time is literally on his side.
It is,
and that's an interesting point. But I guess the one thing that does changed a little bit is that even if he does survive, that timeline's overwritten anyway.
Oh yeah,
right?
it's overwritten. It doesn't matter. So even if Doc A is totally fine, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. That guy's
not
gone.
at all.
But either way, I mean, we get to see two flashes of Doc Brown. Old man Brown and young man Brown.
Yep.
And no matter which way you carve it up, they're both making decisions that are somewhat selfish. They're devious. They're misleading.
Yep.
And in my mind, it removes me from viewing him in the same light that I did when I first watched it as a child.
And credit to Christopher Lloyd's acting ability that he can definitely pull off this kind of whimsical, crazy in a cute way old man, when really it's like, I think he's crazy, but when you look at it, he's not cute. This man's a killer, and
he will kill again.
He will, because that happens probably in the next two movies. He's totally okay with it. But again, we won't get into those. We won't get into those tonight.
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to parts 2 and 3, and once again we'll analyze them together because they were filmed at the same time, like we mentioned. And here's some perfect irony for you, Joe. You know how we mentioned the idea of trilogies in the first episode here?
Yes.
And how it, by 2, the first movie made a decent movie, so we're gonna make 2. And then 3, we just want closure. I will say that despite all the things that we've mentioned about Doc Brown being a killer, stone cold killer, the movie still remains to be very entertaining.
Oh, completely. Like, I love that movie.
Yeah,
completely. Yeah. Who does? I mean, there are people who don't like the movie, but I'm not in that camp. I really enjoy Back to the Future.
Yeah. Now, I will leave you with one parting note here, which might wrap a little bow on this, even though this is bringing it into the real world. So when I was a child, we visited Universal Studios in Hollywood, California, and we actually got to visit the town square where they filmed this. It was on a back lot, at Universal Studios.
Yep.
So we actually went through. We got to drive around. You got to see the whole town and everything.
Ooh.
But what would happen only a few years later? It would be burned down.
Crazy.
Now, I'm not saying that Doc Brown Time Monster had something to do with it. Potentially, it's to clean up his own mess.
Yeah, but maybe he just couldn't leave a trace.
Yeah, he did not want to leave a trace.
No. And keeping with tradition that could start, or at least we did in the last episode. And since you brought up the back lot, you'll notice in the first movie, there's a great scene that takes place in that back lot where Biff is chasing Marty A out of the diner, and then he goes up to the kid, rips the weird like wooden crate thing apart, so it's just a skateboard, and whimsy happens throughout the square there, and it ends with Biff slamming into the manure truck and the manure coming out through it. Later in the movie, We find out that little maneuver cost Biff Tannen $300 to fix his car, his 53 Ford. But if we count for inflation, just like
Of
we did with
course.
Winston's 11.5 a year, we can look at why Biff is actually kind of mad, because that cost him $2,944 to fix in today's monies.
That's a
That
lot of car
sucks.
wax. Yeah, that's a lot of car wax there,
A
man.
lot of car wax, and who knows what to get the manure out of literally everything in the material, and Billy Zane's hair.
Yeah. Yeah, that is an important thing. That is a great moment to leave off on, is that
Mhm.
part of Biff Tannen's posse involves a very young Billy Zane, not to be confused with Arnold Vosloo, Lord Imhotep himself. We're talking the dude from the Titanic, okay, who
Mhm.
also backs up Derek Zoolander. And yes, I love the fact that
And the
Billy Zane.
Phantom, don't forget the Phantom. Billy
Oh,
Zane is the Phantom.
how could I forget? People who don't have Billy Zane's entire catalog memorized, they're just not living a full
No.
life.
And are they truly Americans? I don't think so. I just don't.
Well, that's as good a time as any, as I think, to wrap this one up, to put a little bow on it.
I'll admit, after having watched this film again recently, there's no way I can ever go back to seeing Doc Brown as anything other than a self-serving jerk.
Yeah, sometimes, Joe, we don't know where we're going to land, but this time it was deliberate and very clear that Doc Brown is indeed a self-serving, time-manipulating, space-time continuum destroying psychopath, which I still feel like is putting it very lightly. Either way, though, for more pop culture discussions, join the conversation on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook by searching for Digital Dissect 1 or Digital Dissection, a nerd podcast. Please also leave us a review, no matter where you found us. Tell a friend. This will all help us to keep bringing you more quality content. Next week, we'll be taking a slight detour from our typical content as we discuss the more intimate side of robots and the sex we seem to be obsessed with having with them. And until next time, keep on dissecting.